Here's what I want to share with you. Psychologists have found that during periods of severe stress, like a pandemic, afterwards there is tremendous growth. They call it post traumatic growth. And we have all definitely been disrupted. But in dealing with this disruption, dealing with this upheaval, we found that we're much better at disrupting ourselves, at stepping back from who we are to slingshot into who we want to be. That's why I don't necessarily think it's the great resignation, but more like the great aspiration. We're not resigning from, we're aspiring to. We want more. We're ready to grow. We want to grow. We don't always know how, and we don't want to walk in circles, which, by the way, is a real thing. The Planck Institute, they did a study and they had people go into a forest and said, "We want you to walk in a straight line." There were no landmarks. They just needed to rely on their sense of direction. Well, how do you think they did? They all thought they did pretty well. But when the GPS data came back, it found that they were walking in loops as tight as 20 meters in diameter. They were walking in circles. So if you're in this place where you want to grow, it helps if you know what growth looks like. It helps if you have a map. And so what I want to present to you over the next few minutes is a map, and it's called the S curve of learning. Some of you are probably familiar with the S curve. It was popularized by the sociologist Rogers back in the 50s and 60s, and he used it to look at how how groups change. Well, we used it at our Disruptive Innovation Fund to think about how quickly an innovation would be adopted. At the base of the S, growth is slow until a tipping point is reached or the knee of the curve, and you move into hypergrowth, and saturation growth tapers off. Well, as we invested, I had this insight, this aha, that we could also use the S curve to understand how we learn and how we grow. And that's why I call it the S curve of learning, because it helps us understand how it looks and how it feels. And the S curve answers questions like, why is it so hard to start something new? And why, once I do start, does it become easier? And why, when I'm really good at something, do I feel like I can no longer do it? It's tracing this emotional arc of growth. So here's how it works. Every time you start something new, you start a new job, you start a new project, you are at the launch point of that S. See if you can see the slide. Okay, if we can put up the slide, please, Megan. You were at the launch point of that S. Every time you start something new, oh, my slide has disappeared. Okay, we are being disrupted right and left, everybody. Let me pull this back up because I do want you to see this S curve. Let's see, where are you? Here we go. Can you see it now, Megan? Or I can pull it up. Let's just do that. Let's do that. Okay, share screen. Here we go. Okay, now you can see it. I'm gonna make it a little, and then Megan, yeah, perfect. Thank you, Megan. All right, so every time you start something new, you are at the launch point of that S. Your brain is running this predictive model, and it's trying to figure out, how am I going to get to the top of this S curve? So it's running lots and lots of predictions, many of which are inaccurate. And so the dopamine drops. At the same time, you're processing all of this information. And as you process this information, because there's so much new, you're literally making memories, you can have this cognitive overload. There's also the questions of identity. Who am I if I'm not who I was? And so you can have these feelings of being overwhelmed, discouraged, frustrated, impatient. And so it can feel very much like a slog. It's not that growth is not happening at the launch point. It's just not that it's yet apparent. And so it feels slow. Then there's a sweet spot. What's happening here? Well, your brain is continuing to run these predictive models, but they're increasingly accurate. And so you're getting lots and lots of dopamine, these emotional upside surprises. You're not processing as much information as you were. And this thing that you were doing is gradually becoming a part of who you are. And so it's hard, but not too hard, easy, but not too easy. It is exhilarating. You feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be. And growth not only is fast, it feels fast. So you have slow, and then you have fast, and then there is mastery. At this point, the model, you've figured it out. But because you're no longer getting the dopamine, you can start to get kind of bored. Sure, not a lot of information that you have to process, and sure, the identity is intact, it's status quo, but you're bored. There's nothing new here. And time seems to pass quickly because there's nothing new to see, but you've got this experience of it being slow. So slow and then fast and then slow is how you grow. And once you understand what growth looks like, once you understand where you are in your growth, you increase your capacity to grow. So now that's the overall model, the overall framework that allows you to think about your growth. I want to now get very tactical, very practical. Whenever you start something new, you're at the launch point. And I want you to think about this because what's going to happen is once you know what experience you're going to have, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to feel impatient. You're going to feel discouraged. That allows you to say, oh, I'm supposed to feel this way. Situation normal. By knowing it's hard, it makes it easier. The second thing that I want you to remember is that as you move off this curve, or as you think about this curve, moving along the curve is basically a dopamine management exercise, where at the launch point, your dopamine drops. When you're in the sweet spot, it goes up. You have these emotional upside surprises. And in mastery, it goes up a little. And so if you want to move off the launch point, you set small, ridiculously small goals. It's basically a hack. So you can say, I get dopamine from that gives me momentum to move up this bigger S curve that I want to move up. So, for example, a few years ago, I had interviewed James Clear for my podcast. He wrote the book Atomic Habits. And after interviewing him, I thought, I think I want to start running. Well, did I start running 30 minutes a day? No. Did I run 15 minutes a day? No. I started with something very small so I could gain momentum. I started with 5 minutes a day, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds of walking, 30 seconds of running, 30 seconds of walking, of running, etc. And then I increased it by about 10 seconds a day. Now, a couple of years later, I run 1 to 2 miles several times a week. So when you're at the launch point of this year, the launch point, I hope of thinking of this as the great aspiration, not the great resignation. You want to remember if it feels slow, that's how it's supposed to feel. If you feel overwhelmed, that's how it's supposed to feel. And in fact, being at the launch point is a very important place because you're figuring things out and you're deciding, do I even want to be here? And then you can gain that momentum, but you want to honor this place of slow. The second thing, again, it's a dopamine management exercise. So you manage your dopamine by setting small, ridiculously small goals. Now, to wrap up, I want to tell you one final story. When I was an equity analyst at the launch point of the curve, I had just built my financial model. And in building this model, it was now time for me to go public with my very first stock recommendation. The valuation was reasonable, but the stock had gone up a lot. And so, what if I put a buy on the stock and then my very first stock pick, the stock goes down? There wasn't any reason why it would, but not wanting to look foolish, I went to my boss and said, let's just put a neutral on this stock, which means don't buy, don't sell. One of my colleagues called me a shrinking violet, which I own. But my boss then really pressed me and he said, Whitney, why wouldn't it keep going up? The numbers are good and they have momentum. Well, I did stop shrinking and I did put a buy on the stock, and happily the stock did go up. But since then, I have really wondered, about that question, why wouldn't the stock keep going up? And it's led to a deeper question, which is, do I believe that humans can keep going up? Do I believe that we can continue to grow? It's been 20 years since I put a buy on that stock, but my answer is yes. Growth is our default setting. Human growth is unbounded. The more we grow, the more we can grow. And the S curve of learning, it can help. It's a map that tells you where you were, where you are, where you want to go. It helps you get smart about your growth. And so I leave you with this. If you want to go up, you gotta disrupt.